This part of the chapter is looking at the Me Too movement and sexual harassment and sex segregation within the subject that we're talking about right now, which is work and employment. So, uh, as you might imagine, sexual harassment is an important mechanism for creating sex segregation and the gender wage gap. There are studies that have shown that the effects, it's very sad, the effects of sexual harassment on victims' mental and physical health, even decades after. And that includes depression, increased anger, and self doubt. We've heard a lot of testimony about these issues lately and the effects it has on women. Uh, Sexual harassment also decreases job satisfaction, as you might imagine, and increases absenteeism and withdrawal from work, which results in deteriorating relationships and coworkers and is absolutely not good for the employer either. In addition to the individual costs, it costs the U.S. government millions of dollars through, litigation and settlement fees. So, a 2017 study on the effects of sexual harassment on women's careers found that sexual harassment has economic effects on individual women as well as on the labor market in general, and lawsuit costs and litigation, that type of thing. So, women who had experienced sexual harassment were 6.5 times more likely to change jobs. And we know that women are more likely to be sexually harassed in male dominated occupations. So, in addition to the mental and physical costs, women who have been sexually harassed experience financial hardship because they leave those jobs where they've been sexually harassed. There's a job turnover in their lives. They can't work because of psychological problems, etc. So, when how this affects them is that because the gender wage gap is already greater for women of color than for white women, the financial consequences are even more devastating for them. So the women who left a job due to sexual harassment often ended up with a job of lower quality and lower pay. The Me Too movement, it's interesting because we think of it as originating with a sexual harassment lawsuit against Harvey Weinstein, but it actually began 10 years earlier than that with a woman of color named Tarana Burke. And she started it to draw attention to the experiences of women and girls, especially girls and women of color, with sexual violence and with sexual violence in the workplace as well. So, many times on social media around the origins of this movement, Black activists noted that white women had not always supported Black women who were victims of harassment. So, let's look at the wage gap now and how sex segregation matters. First, it's important to reiterate a key point of this whole subject, which is that whether in completely different occupations or doing different kinds of work in the same occupation, women are paid less across the board than their male counterparts. And that's what the gender wage gap is, the ratio of women's earnings to men's average earnings in the same occupation. In the US in 2020, among full year workers, the wage gap was 83.0. And what that means is for every dollar a man makes, a woman makes 83 cents. And the gap still exists when men and women have equal qualifications. Historically, the wage gap had decreased in the United States since 1955, but it stalled and it's pretty much stayed the same in recent years, and there's been very little progress made in closing that wage gap the 83 cents that women make to every dollar a man makes over the last 3 decades. The progress has not been great. So, what are the connections between sex segregation and the wage gap? How are they connected? The segregation of jobs and the gender wage gap. And it's what it is. It's a question about the relationship between difference and inequality. Okay, because sex segregation enforces difference. Men and women are concentrated, as we've seen, in different kinds of jobs and occupations. And that separation into different jobs and occupations both creates and reinforces gender ideologies about the different skills and abilities and needs of men and women, which means that one gender is, quote, better suited to certain kinds of work, and the other gender is better suited to different kinds of work. So it makes the idea of equal pay for equal work attractive in principle, but actually difficult to do. And it's connected, the gender wage gap is connected to sex segregation in 2 ways. First, in any occupation, job, or sector of the workplace in the United States, which is composed of primarily dominant men, and by that we mean white, middle, or upper class men, the wage scale will be higher than the ones that are composed primarily of either men of color or women, regardless of their racial background, the women. So when women or people of color are concentrated in an occupation or job, the compensation will be less. And when women enter an occupation, get this, the wages for that occupation will actually fall. Okay? And we saw that with a real estate situation. When women entered residential real estate, men moved to commercial real estate because they weren't making enough money in residential. This is because, as we saw earlier, women's entry into an occupation or job coincides with a loss of wages for that job. And when women enter new occupations in large numbers, the pay also declines. So of course, it's true that some men and women both work in areas that are either predominantly male or female. But here's the key point. So you can make the argument that, of course, there are women doctors, and of course there are male elementary school teachers, whatever examples you want to use. But here's the key point. While men in areas dominated by women, so let's say male school teachers, elementary school teachers, men in areas dominated by women make less than their male counterparts in predominantly male occupations. So male elementary school teachers or nurses make less money than, because they're female occupations, they make less money than, say, doctors or university professors, okay, to use 2 examples. They still make more than their female counterparts, okay, in those jobs that are predominantly female. So the elementary school teacher, the male nurse still makes more money than the female nurse and the female elementary school teacher in general across the board, okay? And why that happens is primarily because women, wait a minute, I'm sorry. Then the next story is just the opposite. When women move into jobs that are predominantly male, they still make less, okay, than in that job, okay? So they don't get the bump moving into male jobs. The women don't get the bump moving into male jobs that males get moving into female jobs, okay, making a bit more. And it happens primarily because women in a predominantly male workplace are less likely to be promoted. And that's how your pay increases, is through promotions. In many, yes, there's a starting wage that is often very different, but it's those promotions that really can increase your wages. So that's the first thing. Second, the higher paying jobs also involve more authority and supervision of others than lower paying jobs. For example, a plant manager is paid more than a worker, a doctor is paid more than a nurse, partly because they have more authority and the job involves the supervision of others. Any jobs, get this too, any jobs that require workers to interact with people in a nurturing or an interpersonal way, pay less than jobs that require authority and supervision. Okay? And many women, of course, are in jobs that require nurturing or interpersonal interactions. Okay. So we're going to go on to explain now sex segregation and the gender wage gap. How do we explain that? Well, research shows that as much as 90% of the explanation for the gender wage gap is due to the prevalence of sex segregation. So as much as 90% of the wage gap between working men and women has to do with the jobs they're doing, okay? Since we live in a culture where money and income equal power and prestige, the fact that women earn less on average than men gives them less power in family settings, and I would say elsewhere as well. In female headed households in the US and around the world, women's income is the sole source, the only source, and that makes it more difficult for them to support their families because they're earning less. Okay, and globally, these issues have implications for global poverty because women's income can affect families differently than men's income. If you're already poor, then women's lower income can affect their families differently than it would affect than a man's income would. Because women's income is more likely to be directed at supporting a family and trying to provide upward mobility than men's wages are. In addition, the lack of women in positions of power and prestige in corporations, universities, and government means that they have less power to shape policy. Now, I know a lot of people are not, well, policy wonks. They think it's boring. The government never does anything, etc., etc., etc. But what the government does when it's functioning well is create policies, and if they're good policies, they benefit people who can't be benefited in any other way except for laws and regulations and minimum wages and protections against injuries at work and those types of things. And if there are not enough women creating policies, those are not the kind of policies that are going to get created. Okay, you'll see at the end of this some of the policies that some of the women have been working on. So why does the gap exist? Why does occupational sex segregation persist? There are several theoretical answers, and they can be grouped into three categories, like the other sociological theories: individual, interactional, and institutional. And the two we're going to look at are individual and institutional theories. And the first is socialization theory as an explanation for sex segregation. And that's an individual theory. We've looked at socialization in many different chapters. Now we're applying it to the world of work. So remember that individual theories include socialization because gender becomes internal to an individual. And once gender is internalized, as we've discussed, it impacts the decisions, thoughts, and feelings of an individual just unconsciously, automatically, in some very gendered ways. So, according to individual theories, gender operates from the inside out. You remember that? And in relation to sex segregation in jobs, occupational sex segregation, it means that our experiences with gender socialization lead us to different types of jobs according to gender through what's called worker preference. Once again, think about what kinds of jobs you thought about doing when you grew up. For most young people, children and young adults, they're very gendered jobs that people think about doing. And this theory was supported by a study on job aspirations between younger and older women. This is kind of interesting. So if socialization is determining the types in, if socialization in determining the types of jobs women and men want to do, then the shifting gender roles that we've been experiencing in the last few years should have altered patterns of socialization. And what the study found was that was true for younger women, that younger women were more likely than older women to have sex integrated jobs, to think about working in jobs and actually be working in jobs that weren't necessarily traditionally female jobs. So what it suggests is that those younger women responded to the changes in roles that we've been having, as I said recently, and they were choosing jobs that were less typical of what women's work had been in the past. But it was really interesting because that same pattern didn't hold true for men. There were no differences with the men between the level of sex segregation in the jobs of the younger and older men. So it could indicate, that socialization has changed for women in ways that it has not changed for men. So, and it would also include, predispositions for some kinds of work and not for others that were gender based. And what happened with the older women was that they had more sex segregated occupations. And the researchers think that that's because they chose them based on their gender socialization. And older women didn't have the more modern, current ideas of gender that we have today. And so they chose the jobs that they chose based on gender socialization that they were socialized into. And so that they didn't have, their jobs were more stereotypically female jobs, the older women. And other research suggests that the aspirations that we form when we're young, although they're very gender typed, are not necessarily the jobs that we wind up with when we're adults, which is interesting. So human capital theory is the next individual theory, and it comes from an economic perspective. If you've taken an economics class, you're probably very familiar with this theory because it's one of the foremost theories in economics. And what it does is it emphasizes the choice of an occupation resulting from an attempt to maximize the benefits and reduce the costs of a particular job. You see how that came from economics? To maximize the benefits and reduce the costs. So in the case of jobs and occupations, it refers to the skills workers may acquire through education, job training, and job tenure that make them productive at their job. In other words, anything that increases a worker's productivity. I mean, you're all here taking classes in college, well, the vast majority of you, to prepare yourself for some future profession, occupation, etc. Okay, so you're maximizing your opportunities. Okay, so in other words, it's anything increasing a worker's productivity. Education is an important source of human capital because it's required, as I just pointed out, for many occupations, doctors, nurses, lawyers, etc. But education throughout a career can also increase your human capital. And human capital, as we said, is a general theory in economics, but as it applies to sex segregation specifically, there's three important assumptions. First, it's a basic assumption in economics as a discipline that human beings are rationally motivated. Well, we could certainly question that with some people's behavior, but let's go with it. They're rationally motivated. And this is a basic assumption in economics. So in sociology, it's called rational choice. It assumes that people behave in ways that maximize rewards. Here's that concept again. It's rational, right? To maximize your rewards, get as many rewards as you can, and pay as few costs as you can, whether that's psychological or physical or economic, whatever the rewards and costs situation. So, to put it another way, for each decision we make, we think about the pros and cons and pursue the action with more pros, the actions that have more pros, okay? The second assumption follows from the first assumption. If we're rational actors, then it's rational to invest our human capital whenever and however possible, since doing so increases our productivity, which in turn means that we make more money at our jobs. So rational choice theory means that we can be motivated by rewards that also they're not necessarily monetary. However, the reality is that money is the most powerful reward in capitalist societies like the United States. And then the third assumption is that gender is part of this equation of rationality of costs and benefits. So according to human capital theory, men and women on average make different kinds of human capital investments. They make different kinds of rational choices. So to begin with, everyone, male or female, however gendered, everyone is rational to one degree or another. But the unique situation of women leads them to make different types of decisions based on a set of factors that is different from those of men. Then that difference is women's ability to bear children, of course, because, and we know not all women will bear children, but most do, and most plan to at some point in their lives. So, of course, both marriage and childbearing pose very different problems for the future than those of men. So when women do this cost-benefit analysis, when they calculate their career trajectories, they think about their human capital investments differently than men do, because women anticipate being a wife and a mother and how that will affect their jobs and careers. So based on these assumptions that they'll be a wife and a mother someday, women really have two options. The first one is they can choose to simply invest in job-related human capital. For example, if the job or career will be in competition with the role of mother and housewife, one option is actually to invest less of yourself in the job. However, the second option is to choose jobs or occupations that will allow you to maximize your human capital while also meeting the demands of the family at the same time. Now, that's a hard one to do in this country because we don't have family leave, we don't have all kinds of things that the Scandinavian countries in particular do, and big vacation, long a month's paid vacation for everybody, as in France from the beginning, whether you're part-time or not, from the first year. So the decisions about how to use your human capital in relation to family and children are very different in the United States and much more difficult. So the second option of choosing a job that you might be able to do a work around and have family and children is the focus of a lot of research, as you might imagine, because it implies actual predictions about the kinds of jobs most women will choose. So if you want to maintain your human capital, your value, and retain room for the demands of being a mother and a wife, what kind of choices do you have? Most likely, it's going to be some kind of a job that has, ideally, flexible hours and with low penalties for reentry into the profession or occupation after taking time off to have a baby or care for family members. So, for example, teaching is actually perceived as an ideal profession in that regard, where women can maximize their human capital. Because the work hours, as we talked about previously, they correspond to when children are in school, and there are few penalties for teachers leaving the workforce and then returning. In fact, of course, America is desperate for teachers right now, so that leaving the workforce for a while and coming back, you're welcomed back. It's not hard to find a job. Um, the converse, the reverse of that kind of a job are jobs or occupations that require more than a full work week and have little or no flexibility. And those are often the high-powered managerial positions that just require you to be there 60 hours a week and etc. So human capital theory, you can see how that explains sex segregation, because women are choosing different occupations based on a rational calculation that tries to maximize the returns for their lives and the lives of their families. And when a bunch of men and women make those different decisions, then the result is this systematic sex segregation of occupations, because the vast majority of men don't make occupational decisions based on how much flexible time off they have to take care of their babies, right? Okay. So in that way, of course, we wind up with what's called gendered institutions. And an institutional analysis examines how gender is built into the functioning of an organization. And that's called gendered institutions or institutionalized barriers. And the proponents of this theory argue that organizations such as businesses are gendered in very fundamental ways. And that means that sex segregation is maintained because any workplace is inherently gendered from the beginning, and it's taken for granted. Okay. So organizational jobs, routines, and behaviors are all fundamentally gendered in the workplace as they are in society in general. And that explains the power and persistence of sex segregation, because it's a fundamental and integral part of how businesses work, reflecting how the larger society works. It becomes taken for granted in part by supposedly, quote, neutral ways of defining concepts like jobs and wages. If you think about the word job, it's supposedly a gender neutral term. It's a position that can be, filled by anyone. It's a quote job. But for many employers, they already know the ideal human to fill the job, and that's a male worker whose family responsibilities are taken care of by a wife at home. Wages also sounds like a gender neutral term, but it's always been an important factor in the discussion about how much money women and men should make. So traditional debates about appropriate wages were related to this concept of family wage. You've probably heard that terminology, making a family wage. And that's what that means, is the amount that's needed to sustain all family members. Okay. And it's traditionally was conceived as a male wage, because remember, the male breadwinner, based on that ideal of a male breadwinner. So where does that leave women's wages? Well, they were often thought of, especially when women went to work in large numbers initially, as a supplement to male wages, or to other family members. It was women's wages initially in the beginning were never really thought of as providing for all the sustenance of family members. So it was not a quote family wage. But of course, that's not always the case, where women's wages are a supplement to the male breadwinners' wages. And it ignores the many women who are historically and currently are the sole breadwinners in their family. And, where men aren't, and then there are all the men who aren't supporting a family, but still receive a family wage. So the idea of a family wage is, based on these facts, it's not a gender neutral term. More contemporarily, we can see how other similar, quote, gender neutral practices have gendered implications. If you look at internal labor markets, which are the ways in which firms provide structured opportunity for advancement, like promoting from within, well, promotions are likely to be given to individuals in certain types of jobs in a firm than to others. Since women tend to be segregated into occupations and jobs that have fewer positions of authority associated with that kind of work that they're doing than male occupations and positions, then they're less likely to be promoted. One of the ways to look at this is, through the experiences of transgender and non-binary people, which reveal even more about gender on the job. Because in one study of transgender non-binary people, 67%, almost 70%, were terminated, forced to resign, denied a promotion, or not hired into a new position within the last year. The theory that the cases of trans men most supports is that of gendered organizations that we just talked about. And that means that the advantages that cis men are virtually invisible to those men themselves. So, what are some of the solutions? Well, comparable worth and other solutions to the gender wage gap are one. I don't know if you've heard of comparable worth, but that's one of the policies that's promoted. It's a policy that attempts to raise wages of the low-paying jobs that are predominantly occupied by women. So, under the Equal Pay Act of 1963, men and women are supposed to be paid the same in jobs that are, quote, equal. But how do you determine what jobs are equal when no two are exactly the same? So then they got into the idea of job evaluation. So that's one way of doing it, through something called job evaluation. And it's used to create rankings of jobs within an organization. And that ranking consistently shows that women receive lower wages in jobs that are comparable to those occupied by men. So after the 2020 presidential election, two Democratic candidates included proposals to lessen the gender wage gap in their platforms, and Senator Elizabeth Warren's plan focused on the plight of women in color. Now, I know this all sounds like boring, once again, policy wonk stuff, but I want to wrap this up by saying this subject is so important because quite literally, our lives depend on our ability to provide the necessities for survival, and hopefully also for education and empowerment and leisure activities for ourselves and for our families. And unfortunately, many of us live in only survival mode in the richest country in the world. That's the end of this chapter.